In the galaxy's most advanced civilization, war had become a formality. Nobody told the humans. Supreme Fleet Architect Velshara of the Keth Dominion stood at the panoramic viewport of the command deck and watched her armada move through the dark with the precision of a symphony. 94 vessels, destroyers, carriers, and the flagship Enduring Principle glided in perfect formation through the Norin border corridor, their hull lights coordinated in the traditional honor pattern that signaled to any watching civilization, "We are at war, and we are doing it correctly." Correct war was the only kind the Galactic Accord permitted. For 6 centuries, the 17-member species had governed interstellar conflict through the doctrine of proportional engagement, a 12,000-clause legal framework that capped fleet sizes, prohibited strikes on civilian infrastructure, mandated resupply ceasefires every 40 standard hours, and required all fleet commanders to file their intended maneuver patterns 48 hours in advance with the Accord's neutral arbiters. The system had transformed war from a catastrophe into something closer to a formal argument conducted with ships instead of words. Casualties were regrettable but limited. Planets were never touched. The loser conceded. Everyone went home. Velshara had never lost. In 32 years of command, she had prosecuted 11 campaigns, won 11 campaigns, and been decorated 11 times by the Accord's High Council. She was not arrogant. Arrogance implied uncertainty. She was simply accurate. The Norin Collective had refused to cede the Tessavar Nebula, a region of space so saturated in stellarite ore that whoever controlled it would power half their civilization for 3 generations. Velshara understood the refusal. She did not respect it. The Norin fleet was capable, their commanders trained in the finest Accord academies, their ships well-maintained and professionally crewed. But their doctrine was orthodox, predictable. She had run the engagement projections 17 times. Every simulation ended the same way: Keth victory in 11 days. Her senior analyst, Scholar Commander Pren, appeared at her shoulder with a data slate. He was young, barely 40 campaigns into his career, and still prone to overbriefing. "Fleet Architect," he said, "dispatches from the outer fringe. Humanity has formally submitted its application for Accord membership." "Noted," Velshara said, without turning from the viewport. "Their representative is a Director Osai. She has requested observer status at the current." "Denied. We are mid-campaign." Velshara folded her hands behind her back. "File the application. The membership committee will review it in the standard 2-year window. Humanity is young. They will wait." Pren hesitated. "Our cultural database on humanity is thin, 2 centuries of spaceflight, 16 prior conflicts documented, mostly internal." "Internal conflicts," Velshara said. It was almost amusing. Every species fought itself before it found its footing. They always outgrew it. Then they know less of real war than even the youngest Accord species. "File the application, Scholar Commander. We have a nebula to acquire." She dismissed him with a gesture and turned back to her fleet, her perfect, beautiful, rule-following fleet, and felt the quiet confidence of a woman who had never encountered a problem she could not solve inside the rules of civilized engagement. She had 4 days before that confidence would begin to crack, 11 before it shattered completely. In the dark beyond the sensor range of every ship in the corridor, something large had been running silent for 18 hours. It had no honor lights. It had filed no maneuver pattern. Its hull was not marked with any Accord identification code. And it was, in terms of sheer tonnage, unlike anything that had ever been registered in the Accord's 6 centuries of military records. Its name was painted in block letters across its bow in a language most Accord species had only recently begun to translate: UNSS Thermopylae. Its captain, a man named Yusuf Danso, sat in his command chair, drank coffee from a thermos, and studied the Norin fleet's formation with the patient, unhurried attention of someone who had spent 20 years learning exactly how to break things that thought they were unbreakable. He had read every file humanity had on Accord warfare. He had found it instructive. He had also found it, if he was being honest with himself, a little bit sad. He finished his coffee, set the thermos down, looked at his crew. "All right," he said quietly. "Let's go introduce ourselves." Humanity asked to help. The Accord wasn't sure that was good news. The Norrin defensive line held on day 4 in a way that Velshara's projections had declared statistically improbable. Not because the Norrin were doing anything unprecedented. They were following doctrine with admirable precision. But because Admiral Sothvar of the Norrin fleet had apparently memorized her doctrine just as thoroughly as she had memorized his. Every flanking maneuver she attempted was already bracketed. Every probe was absorbed and countered. The 11-day projection quietly revised itself to 17, then 22. On day 5, a private channel opened to the enduring principle. The sender identified herself as Director Camille Osai, Senior Diplomatic Attaché of the United Nations of Earth, speaking from a vessel currently operating in the Tessevar corridor. Her transmission was polite, precise, and delivered in flawless Keth standard, which alone put her ahead of most species the Accord had encountered at humanity's developmental stage. "Fleet Architect Velshara," Osai said, her face calm and her posture composed, the posture, Velshara noted, of someone who was very deliberately projecting calm. "We are aware of your current operational difficulties. We have an asset in the region that may be of service. In exchange, we ask only that humanity's membership application receive expedited review." "What asset?" Velshara asked. A pause, "a warship." Velshara almost smiled. Human warships, if their cultural database was accurate, were small patrol craft primarily, perhaps a light cruiser at most. The offer was almost certainly symbolic, a political gesture designed to buy goodwill. She could work with symbolic. "Send me its specifications." Another pause, slightly longer. "It might be easier if you simply saw it." The instinct that had kept Velshara undefeated for 32 years told her something was off about that phrasing. She ordered her senior analysts to pull everything humanity had filed with the Accord's pre-membership registry, ship classifications, military inventories, conflict records. The file arrived in minutes. It was, as Pren had said, thin, but it was not empty. The analysts worked through the night. They were Keth, a species that processed information quickly, slept rarely, and were not given to emotional responses. So when Scholar Commander Pren set their compiled summary on Velshara's desk at the 3rd hour of the morning watch and stood there without speaking, she looked up. "Well," she said. Pren had the expression of a man who had been asked to describe a color that did not exist. "Fleet Architect. Humanity has been at war with itself internally for approximately 50,000 years, continuously, with brief pauses. All species have periods of internal conflict. Not," he set the slate down carefully. "Not like this. They have something called the Siege of Masada, the Punic Wars, the 100 Years' War, the World Wars. There were 2 of those within 40 years of each other. A conflict called Vietnam that a larger power could not win despite overwhelming material advantage. They developed biological weapons, nuclear weapons, psychological operations, siege engines. They once besieged a city for 10 years over a personal insult." He paused. "The 10-year siege worked." Velshara studied him. "You are concerned." "I am noting," Pren said carefully, "that every Accord species that we consider militarily sophisticated has had, at most, a few hundred years of recorded warfare. Humanity has had 50,000, and they never stopped innovating." He looked at the data slate. "They learned from every loss, every one of them." There was a silence on the bridge. Velshara accepted Director Osai's offer the next morning. She told herself it was pragmatism. She told herself a small human warship, whatever its unusual history, could at minimum serve as a useful probe vessel to draw Norrin fire. She told herself many things. At 3:40 Fleet Standard Time, a contact appeared on the long-range sensors of every ship in the Keth formation. It was not coming from human space. It had been running dark, cold, and completely invisible for 18 hours, sitting in the blind spot created by the Norrin's own sensor interference pattern. a blind spot that should have required months of observation to identify. It had found it in 18 hours. The contact resolved on screens across the fleet. Officers leaned forward. One ensign on the sensor deck said, very quietly, "That cannot be right." And then the size classification finalized, and 3 senior officers said nothing at all, because there were no words in Keth standard for what they were looking at. Pren looked at Velshara. "That," he said, "is not a frigate. It arrived wrong. Everything about it was wrong. That was the point." 4.1 kilometers. That was the length of the UNSS Thermopylae from bow to aft thruster array. And it was a number that caused 3 different Keth officers to independently rerun their sensor calibrations, because the alternative was accepting that a species with 2 centuries of spaceflight had somehow constructed a warship that dwarfed anything in the Accord's registered naval inventory by a factor of 3. It had materialized, and that word was not inaccurate. It had simply been there and then suddenly was visible, 700 kilometers off the Enduring Principles port bow. Accord arrival protocol required FTL ingress at a minimum of 10,000 kilometers from any Allied vessel, with advance notice filed no less than 6 hours prior. The Thermopylae had filed nothing. It had given no notice. It had simply chosen a position that happened to be, Velshara's tactical officers noted with private horror, in the single gap of the Keth formation that offered the best firing angles on the Norrin line. It was not decorated. No honor lights, no formal color identification, no ceremonial hull markings. Its surface was matte black, an ablative ferrocarbon composite that sensor analysis suggested would absorb rather than reflect energy weapon strikes. The hull itself was scarred, long, parallel scoring marks that had been partially repaired but not cosmetically finished. This ship had been in combat before, and whoever crewed it had prioritized function over appearance in the repairs. A hail opened. The man who appeared on Velshara's screen was in his mid-50s by human reckoning, brown-skinned, with close-cropped gray hair and the careful, unhurried eyes of someone who assessed everything before he commented on anything. He wore a dark uniform with minimal insignia. He looked like a man who found formality useful but not interesting. "Fleet Architect Velshara," Captain Yusuf Danso said. "Yusuf Danso, UNSS Thermopylae, thanks for having us. I'll need your tactical package, current Norrin positions, fleet compositions, last 48 hours of engagement logs." He glanced at something off-screen. "Also your stellar cartography for the Tessevar corridor. Specifically, I want the locations of any significant asteroid concentrations within 2 light towers." Velshara kept her expression neutral through long practice. "Captain Danso, welcome. Before I can share that, may I ask what armament your vessel carries, for our tactical records?" A brief pause. "I can give you a general summary." "Please." 12 primary kinetic rail batteries, 8 coherent energy turrets, 4 mass driver bays, approximately 4,000 autonomous impactor drones, variable payload, marine complement of 320. He tilted his head. "Point defense suite, electronic warfare package, and some things that don't translate well into Keth standard." The bridge was very quiet. Scholar Commander Pren leaned close to Velshara's ear. "Fleet Architect," he murmured. "A preliminary review suggests this vessel is in technical violation of 14 separate clauses of the Proportional Engagement Doctrine. The mass driver bays alone." "I heard him ask about asteroids," Velshara said quietly. "Yes. He wants to use asteroids as weapons." "That would be my interpretation, yes." She looked at Danso on the screen. He was waiting with the patience of someone who had waded through much harder things than this. "Captain," she said, "I'm obligated to point out that several of your vessel's apparent capabilities conflict with Accord engagement doctrine." "I appreciate that," Danso said. He sounded like he genuinely did. "Can I ask which specific treaties humanity has ratified so far?" Pren checked his slate. His expression shifted through several emotions in rapid succession. "None yet," he said. "Membership is still pending." Then I'd say we're operating in good faith within our current treaty obligations, Danso said pleasantly, which are none. Tactically speaking, that does give us some flexibility. He leaned forward slightly. Fleet Architect, I've read your engagement logs with the Norrin line. You're fighting them the way they expect to be fought. I'd like to try something different. Send me that asteroid data. Velshara held his gaze for a long moment. In 32 years of command, she had trusted her instincts exactly as much as her data. Her instincts right now were pulling in two directions simultaneously. Profound unease at everything this man represented, and the cold strategic recognition that the Norrin line was not breaking, and this man, this ship, was something the Norrin had never seen and had no doctrine for. She sent the data. Danso nodded once. Thank you, give us 6 hours. He paused. You might want to move your fleet back about 200 kilometers if that's convenient. Why? Just a preference, he said, and ended the call. They used rocks, moving at 30% of the speed of light. The Norrin had no word for what happened next. The Norrin Collective's defensive fleet was arranged in the crescent formation, 90 vessels spread across 600 kilometers of space in a concave arc, designed to focus overlapping fire on anything that approached the center. It was an elegant solution to the problem of three-dimensional space combat. Admiral Sothvar had used it to defeat Accord opponents in 4 separate campaigns. It worked because it presented no weak point. Attack the center, and you faced concentrated fire from 90 ships. Attack the flanks, and you faced a closing pincer. It assumed the attacker would come from a predictable direction, at a predictable speed, using predictable weapons. The Thermopylae appeared at the edge of the Norrin sensor range and did something no Accord commander had ever done in 6 centuries of documented warfare. It decelerated, not to a fighting approach speed, to almost nothing. It came in slow, broadcasting openly on all Norrin frequencies, not a distress signal, not a hail, but a simple continuous identification tone that said, plainly and undisguisedly, "Here I am, I see you, I am not hiding." Admiral Sothvar and his command center aboard the cruiser Norrin's Patience watched this on his screens and felt the first cold finger of something unfamiliar. In his experience, commanders who broadcast openly were either surrendering or creating a distraction. He looked at his tactical display. There was nothing else on sensors, no flanking force, no second wave. Open fire, he said, because the alternative was waiting, and waiting was how you lost. 60 Norrin vessels opened fire simultaneously on the Thermopylae. The coherent light batteries of the Norrin fleet represented approximately 18 terawatts of combined output, enough to vaporize any vessel in the Accord's conventional inventory in under 30 seconds. The fire was accurate. It hit. It kept hitting. The Thermopylae continued to decelerate. The ablative ferrocarbon armor shed energy the way a cliff face sheds rain. Not perfectly, secondary systems began to register heat buildup, but it shed enough. The ship slowed to nearly a full stop in the center of the kill zone, absorbing the full combined fire of 60 warships, and the crew inside it continued to work. Calmly, methodically, as if being shot at by 60 ships was a background condition, an inconvenience to be noted and set aside. The Thermopylae's ventral bays opened. What emerged was not a torpedo salvo. Torpedo salvos the Norrin knew. What emerged was a field 4,000 autonomous impactor drones, each roughly the size of a ground car, preloaded with navigational solutions that had been calculated over the previous 6 hours using the asteroid field data Velshara had provided. In the corridor behind the Thermopylae, positioned over those same 6 hours while the Keth fleet had been fighting the Norrin line, 17 asteroid fragments ranging from 50 to 400 meters in diameter had been nudged, gently, patiently, precisely, onto calculated approach vectors. The drones were not weapons. The drones were navigation aids, final correction thrusters for objects that were already moving at 28% of the speed of light. The Norrin crescent formation was optimized for energy weapons in open space. Its sensor suites were calibrated to detect ship-scale objects at long range and energy discharge signatures at medium range. It was not calibrated for fast-moving, low-radar cross-section rock, because in 600 years of Accord warfare, nobody had used rocks. Rocks were not proportional. Rocks were not civilized. Rocks were not in the doctrine. 11 Norrin vessels were disabled in the first 4 minutes. Not destroyed. The Thermopylae calculations had been threaded with surgical precision to disable rather than obliterate, targeting drive systems and weapon mounts rather than crew compartments. 3 more were knocked out of formation by the shockwaves of near misses. The Crescent, which required exact positioning to maintain its overlapping fire, began to collapse. Sothvar watched his perfect formation come apart and felt something he had not felt in a long and decorated career, genuine bewilderment. What, he started. His tactical officer was already pulling data. What did they hit us with? The officer looked up from her console with an expression that would later be described in her official report as professionally compromised. "Rocks, Admiral," she said. "They hit us with rocks." Aboard the Enduring Principle, 200 kilometers back, Scholar Commander Pren had not spoken for 3 minutes. He turned to Velshara. His voice, when it came, was barely above a whisper. "Fleet Architect, did they use rocks?" Velshara watched the Norrin formation fragmenting on her tactical display. "Yes," she said, "they did. That's not in any doctrine. That's not in any protocol. That's..." "Pren," she held up one hand, "get me Captain Danso." Danso appeared on screen. He looked exactly as calm as he had 6 hours ago. Behind him, someone was running a systems damage assessment. Someone else was refilling what appeared to be a coffee thermos. "You absorbed 60 ships' worth of fire," Velshara said, "deliberately." "Yes. You used asteroids as weapons. As delivery vectors, technically. The asteroids were the weapons." He paused. "We prefer to call it kinetic geology." There was a silence. Then Velshara said, with the careful tone of someone keeping a very tight grip on their composure, "What do you need from us to continue?" "Coffee, if you have it," Danso said, "and the Norrin supply chain maps. I want to understand where they're getting their power cells." He glanced at his crew. "We're just getting started." Rulebook that had governed war for 6 centuries had never met a species that didn't care about the rulebook. The Norrin Collective filed 23 simultaneous protest motions with the Accord High Council within the first hour. They cited violations of the Proportional Engagement Doctrine, the Gentleman's Armistice Clauses, the Tessevar Corridor Transit Agreements, the Convention on Acceptable Munitions, and the Protocol on Pre-Battle Notification. The filing was thorough, legally precise, and represented an enormous amount of work done by a great many Norrin lawyers in a very short period of time. Director Camille Osai sat before the High Council's emergency session with a tablet on her knee and listened to all 23 charges read aloud in full. She nodded through each one with the expression of someone taking careful and genuine notes. When the reading concluded, the Council's presiding arbiter looked at her and asked formally whether humanity wished to respond. "We do," Osa said. "First, could you clarify which of these treaties humanity has formally ratified?" The silence that followed was the specific silence of 17 species, simultaneously consulting their legal staff. "The membership review is ongoing," the arbiter said finally. "So none," Osei said, in the tone of someone confirming a fact they had already confirmed privately but wanted on the official record. "Humanity has ratified none of these agreements because humanity is not yet a member. We applied for membership in good faith. We dispatched a vessel to assist an ally in good faith. We operated within the full scope of our current treaty obligations, which are," she checked her tablet, "none. We have no current treaty obligations as we are not members." The resulting constitutional crisis occupied the Accord's legal scholars for years. But that argument, however important, however valid, was not the crisis that kept Fleet Architect Velshara awake that night. She had spent 6 hours with her entire senior tactical staff reviewing the Thermopylae engagement data. Every sensor log, every firing solution, every trajectory. They had been thorough and they had been honest, and the conclusion they had reached was the one she had been dreading before the analysis even began. Humanity had not broken the rules of war. They had simply operated under a different set of rules, older ones, tested ones, rules refined over 50,000 years of doing the actual brutal mathematics of conflict. And within those rules, they had been precisely, surgically correct. The asteroid approach had been identified as viable by the engagement environment. The deliberate fire absorption had served a tactical purpose. It had fixed the Norrons' attention and fire on a single target while the real blow was set up. The impactors had been calibrated to disable rather than destroy, limiting casualties while maximizing tactical disruption. It was not barbarism. It was better than the Accord's way of doing things, and that was the problem. The Accord's doctrine of proportional engagement had not made war more humane because it made war harder to fight. It had made war more predictable, and predictability, Velshara now understood with horrible clarity, was simply a vulnerability that no one had exploited because everyone had agreed not to. The moment an actor entered the system who had not agreed, all that elegant doctrine became a cage that one side was locked in and the other was free to walk around. She requested a private meeting with Captain Danso. He arrived in her conference room aboard the Enduring Principle without ceremony, declined offered refreshment, sat, and looked at her with those patient, assessing eyes. He had brought no staff. Neither had she. "How did you know?" she asked. "About the sensor blind spot, about where our formation was weakest, about the asteroid field. You had 18 hours before you identified yourself to us. You spent that time doing all of this." "We read your engagement logs," Danso said. "All of them. Not just the Norran campaign, all of them. Every campaign filed with the Accord in the last 6 centuries. 6 centuries of records, in 18 hours. We had good analysts," he said simply, "and we weren't reading to admire them. We were reading to find the patterns." "And what patterns did you find?" Danso was quiet for a moment, not choosing whether to answer, choosing how. "You fight each other the same way every time," he said at last. "Different ships, different names, different systems, but the same assumptions, the same shape, because you all learned war from each other inside the same system for the same 6 centuries. He looked at her steadily. "We learned it differently." She asked the question that had been building since the first sensor contact. "How did your species survive it? 50,000 years of that." For the first time, something shifted in Danso's expression. Not quite a smile, something older and heavier than a smile. "We almost didn't," he said. "Several times, that's why we kept getting better at it." He paused. "And also why we really, genuinely do not want to do it anymore." Velshara held his gaze. In 32 years of reading commanders across a negotiating table, she had become very good at detecting performance. This was not performance. This was a man who had seen what his species could do and had chosen, consciously, to direct it outward and not inward. She decided then that humanity being in the Accord was not something to be managed. It was something to be cultivated. "Tell me," she said, "what you see when you look at the Norrons' next move." Danso leaned forward. "Their best card is something called the Veil Armada, 43 stealth vessels, sensor invisible." He paused. "I've been thinking about that for about 2 days. Every war humanity ever lost taught them something. They never stopped learning." The briefing took 3 hours. Velshara had requested it and then sat through it with the stillness of someone determined not to let anything show on their face, though by the end of the first hour she had given up on that entirely. Captain Danso did not boast. That was the first thing she noticed. He did not present humanity's military history the way a conqueror presents trophies. He presented it the way a doctor presents a patient's chart, clinically, with attention to what had gone wrong as much as what had gone right. He spoke about losses as readily as victories. He spoke about the wars humanity had lost and what those losses had forced them to learn. He spoke about the wars that had ended not through military victory, but through exhaustion, negotiation, the collapse of the will to continue, the recognition that no achievable victory was worth the cost of achieving it. Vietnam, he said at one point, a powerful nation with overwhelming material advantage, fought to a standstill by a smaller force using irregular tactics, supply line disruption, and a willingness to sustain losses that the larger power's population eventually found politically intolerable. The larger power withdrew. The smaller power won. He paused. We analyzed every military engagement of the past 12,000 years for exactly those kinds of lessons. What beats strength? What beats numbers? What beats technology? The answers exist. They've always existed. You just have to be willing to look at the evidence honestly. Velshara thought about the Accord's 6 centuries of carefully codified, proportional, gentlemanly war, and wondered, with a discomfort she could not quite suppress, how many lessons her civilization had stopped being able to learn the moment the rules made every engagement look the same. But the briefing was not purely historical, because while Danso was speaking, the Norin collective was moving. The intelligence came through on the 4th hour. Admiral Sothvar had requested activation of the Vale Armada. 43 stealth vessels, the most advanced sensor-defeat technology in the Accord's collective knowledge, capable of operating in complete electromagnetic silence for up to 30 days. The Vale Armada had ended 6 wars. The last time it had been deployed, the opposing fleet had simply never seen it coming, had woken one morning to find themselves surrounded, outgunned, with no choice but immediate surrender. Velshara's senior staff greeted the intelligence with the specific silence of experienced officers recognizing a threat they had no counter for. The Accord had never developed an effective counter to the Vale Armada. Attempting to fight sensor-invisible ships in open space was an exercise in futility. You could not target what you could not detect. The doctrine in the face of Vale deployment was stark: concede or die. Options? Velshara asked the room. The room gave her none, because the room was thinking inside 6 centuries of established doctrine, and inside that doctrine there were none. She looked at Danso. He had been listening to the intelligence briefing with his arms folded and his eyes on the middle distance, the posture she had come to recognize of a man actively processing. "You've been thinking about this for 2 days," she said. "What did you conclude?" "The Vale tech defeats active sensors," he said. "Electromagnetic, thermal, gravitometric, we can't see them coming." He unfolded his arms. "But they're still ships. They still need power. They still burn fuel. They still have to position themselves before they strike, which means they have to know where we're going to be." He looked at Velshara. "Can you fake your fleet's position data? Make it look like the flagship is somewhere it isn't?" "We have done this before. Decoy drones, heat emitters, but the Vale Armada would see through." "Not if the deception is good enough," Danso said. "Not if it's better than anything they've seen before." He paused. "Give me your sensor signature data for the enduring principle. Every reading they would take. I want to replicate it." Pren looked at Velshara. "Fleet architect, if Captain Danso is suggesting what I believe he is suggesting." "He is suggesting using the flagship as bait," Velshara said, "except the flagship won't be there." She looked at Danso. "And the Thermopylae will be waiting." "Running cold, dark above the ecliptic," Danso confirmed. "At an altitude no Accord commander would choose for a combat position because it offers no formation support." He almost smiled. "Which means they won't be looking there." The plan had approximately 16 ways to fail. Velshara could identify all 16 without effort. She also knew, with the clarity that had made her undefeated for 32 years, that it was the only option on the table that had any realistic chance of working. "What do you need?" she asked. 48 hours of prep time, your full sensor signature library," and he glanced at his communicator, "some of your people's time. My crew has never worked with Keth ECM suites. We'll need to integrate." He stood. "Oh, and whoever makes your coffee on this ship, I'd like to formally request a transfer to my crew." Pren blinked. "This is a joke." "Mostly," Danso said and left. Velshara sat in her conference room alone for a moment after he went. Outside, somewhere in the sensor-invisible dark, 43 Veil ships were moving into position, confident in an advantage that had never failed them. They were coming for her fleet with certainty, with doctrine, with 6 centuries of Accord warfare behind their every decision. She almost felt sorry for them. The Veil Armada had never failed. It was about to learn what that had cost it. At 200 Fleet Standard Time, 43 sensor-invisible ships decloaked simultaneously around what their targeting systems identified as the Keth flagship Enduring Principle. They were wrong. What they had surrounded was a dispersed field of 412 sensor drones, 68 heat emitters, a network of metallic chaff suspended in precise electromagnetic configuration, and 3 decommissioned Keth scout vessels running their reactor cores at output levels calibrated to exactly match the flagship's power signature. The deception was not perfect. A careful, unhurried sensor sweep would have identified irregularities. But Admiral Sothvar had not ordered a careful, unhurried sweep. He had ordered an immediate killing strike. The Veil Armada's opening salvo hit ghost ships and drone arrays. The response they received was not from the flagship. It was from above. 212 kilometers above the ecliptic plane, the UNSS Thermopylae powered up from full cold dark in 11 seconds flat, a restart time that the Keth engineering staff would later declare impossible, and which the Thermopylae's chief engineer, one Commander Adiz Ez, would later describe as uncomfortable but achievable. The ship was moving before its sensors had fully resolved. It was firing before it had achieved battle speed. The Veil Armada's stealth systems made them invisible to sensors. They did not make them invulnerable to railgun slugs traveling at relativistic velocity from a position no one had been watching. The first 3 minutes were chaotic in the way that only close-range space combat can be, simultaneously vast and intimate. The distances between ships measured in hundreds of kilometers, while the engagement felt suffocatingly personal. The Thermopylae did not fight the way Accord warships fought. It did not hold a line. It moved constantly, unpredictably, trading position for firing angle, accepting minor hits to achieve major ones, using its own drive wash to scatter the Veil ship's sensor readings and deny them targeting locks. The Marine complement launched on the 8th minute. 320 soldiers in assault craft, targeting 5 Veil ships that the Thermopylae's kinetic strikes had disabled but not destroyed. Their objective was not to hold the ships. Their objective was the vessel's navigational cores, specifically the Veil Armada's shared positioning network, which, once accessed, would reveal the locations of every cloaked ship in the formation to the Thermopylae's targeting systems. It took 11 minutes of close quarters fighting through corridors designed by engineers who had never anticipated boarding. The soldiers worked with the same methodical efficiency as the rest of the crew, not frenetic, not dramatic, but relentless in the specific way of people who had been trained to keep moving when everything in their body was telling them to stop. They took casualties. They kept moving. At minute 19, the navigational core came online in the Thermopylae's tactical suite. 43 ghost ships became 43 targets. What followed was 4 more hours of brutal attrition that no Accord doctrine had a name for, because Accord doctrine did not envision engagements of this length or this complexity. Velshara's Keth fleet, held in reserve as agreed, watched it unfold on their screens in the specific silence of experienced warriors witnessing something outside the boundaries of their experience. The Thermopylae did not destroy the Veil ships. That was the detail that lodged deepest in Velshara's memory when she reviewed the logs afterward. It had the firepower. The choice not to use it was deliberate. Danso's standing orders to his crew were to disable and strand, not to obliterate. Drive systems targeted, weapon mounts crippled, life support left intact. Ships rendered helpless rather than wreckage. It was a restraint the Accord doctrine demanded in theory, and its commanders practiced imperfectly. The Thermopylae practiced it in the middle of a 4-hour knife fight, under fire in the dark, and it did not slip once. At 6:14, the Vale Armada's flagship transmitted a distress beacon on open frequencies. 31 of 43 ships were disabled or boarded. The remaining 12 were fleeing at maximum drive. Admiral Sothvar's voice on the distress channel was the voice of a man who had believed, genuinely and for his entire career, that his tools were undefeatable, and had just discovered in the worst possible way that belief was not the same as truth. Velshara opened a channel to the Thermopylae. Danso answered from the command deck. He looked tired in the specific way of someone who had been awake for 30 hours doing very difficult things, not defeated, not relieved, just done. Behind him, his crew moved with the quiet efficiency of people wrapping up a job. "Casualties?" she asked. "7 wounded, none killed," he exhaled. "We were lucky." She knew enough about what she had watched to know that luck was not the primary variable. But she also knew enough about this particular human to know he would not accept an argument on that point tonight. "Stand down and rest," she said. "We'll handle the formal response." "Appreciated." He started to close the channel, then stopped. "Fleet Architect, your people. When you integrate with us for the decoy setup, they were good, quick, flexible." A pause. "You should be proud of them." She had received many compliments in her career. This was the first one that surprised her. The war ended. The galaxy quietly recalculated everything it thought it knew about humanity. The Norin Collective sued for terms on day 16. The Stellarite Nebula would transfer to Keth administration under a shared revenue framework negotiated over the following month. The Vale Armada, or what remained of it, would be decommissioned as a condition of the ceasefire. Sothvar tendered his resignation to the Norin High Council the same morning the terms were filed and was, by all accounts, relieved to do so. It was, technically, the war Velshara had planned to win in 11 days. She had won it in 16. The outcome was as projected. Almost nothing else was. The formal ceasefire signing took place in the Tessevar corridor, with the Thermopylae holding station 10 kilometers off the negotiations vessel, close enough to be clearly visible from every porthole, too far to be threatening. It was not there as a threat. Everyone present understood that it was there as a fact, a reminder, a permanent update to every tactical calculus in the sector. Velshara watched it through the viewport during a recess in the signing ceremony and was struck, not for the first time, by how ordinary it looked at rest. No honor lights, no decoration. Scarred hull, functional repairs, matte black armor that absorbed light rather than reflecting it. It did not look like what had just changed the history of warfare in the Accord. It looked like a working ship crewed by people who had work to do. That, she thought, was probably the point. The Accord High Council's emergency session on humanity's membership application lasted 6 hours. This was remarkable. The previous record for an emergency session was 4 days, set during a border dispute between the Keth and the Velen Syndicate 40 years prior. The debate was not about whether humanity should be admitted. After what the Council's observers had witnessed in the Tessevar corridor, that question answered itself. The debate was about what humanity's membership would mean. For the Accord structure, for its doctrine, for the careful balance of power and protocol that had kept 17 species from destroying each other for 6 centuries. Velshara submitted a formal recommendation in writing and appeared before the council to deliver it in person. She was not an advocate by temperament. She was a tactician. She gave the council tactics. "Humanity," she told them, "has 50,000 years of military evolution that we do not have and cannot replicate. They have already demonstrated the ability to operate effectively alongside our forces, and the judgment to exercise restraint when restraint serves the mission. The question before this council is not whether humanity is dangerous. They are. The relevant question is whether you would prefer that capability directed inside this alliance or outside it." The vote was unanimous. It was the first unanimous vote the council had cast in 11 years. Director Os received the notification while aboard the Thermopylae, where she had spent the last 4 days conducting preliminary integration discussions with Captain Danso's crew. She read it twice, forwarded it to the crew's general channel with 3 words of preamble: "We're in, officially," and then sat for a moment in the small observation lounge off the main corridor and looked at the stars. The crew's reaction was not the celebration she might have expected. There was satisfaction, quiet, genuine, shared but not euphoria. These were people who had just spent 4 days absorbing 60 ships' worth of weapons fire, herding asteroids, and fighting through corridors in the dark. They had a clearer view of what it meant to be in the galaxy's great alliance than most diplomats did. Danso found her there 20 minutes later. He sat across from her, and for a while neither of them spoke. Outside, the Tessivar Nebula glittered, the stellarite ore within it catching starlight and throwing it back in 1,000 colors, beautiful and indifferent to everything that had just been decided around it. "They're scared of us," Osai said finally. It was not a question. "Some of them," Danso said. "Is that bad?" He thought about it honestly, the way he thought about everything. "Depends on what we do with it," he said. "Fear gets you a seat at the table. What you do at the table, that's the actual work." He glanced at her. "That's your department." She nodded slowly. "And if we do it wrong, then we'll have made the galaxy worse." He said it simply, without drama, because it was simply true. "We've done it before, on our own planet. That's the history that nobody in the Accord has read closely enough." He looked at the nebula. "The point is we know what that looks like. We know the cost." In the mission log that Danso filed that evening, a document that would eventually be studied at 17 different military academies across the Accord, he wrote one final entry: "First contact engagement concluded. Norin ceasefire holding. Membership confirmed. Crew performance throughout, exceptional. Recommend commendations for ES, boarding team leads, ECM integration squad." He paused, fingers over the keypad, and then added a single additional line: "We showed them what we are. The rest is on us." Somewhere across the sector, in 17 different command centers and 17 different languages, admirals and fleet architects and war ministers were quietly pulling every file on humanity that existed and reading it with a new and very serious kind of attention. They were updating their models, revising their risk assessments, recalculating every alliance, every border, every treaty in light of a single data point. A species that had nearly destroyed itself a dozen times over had arrived in their galaxy, had spent 6 days demonstrating what that survival had cost and what it had produced, and had then quietly asked for a seat at the table. None of them were entirely comfortable with what they concluded. All of them concluded the same thing. Humanity was here. Humanity was staying. And the Accord, whatever it was going to become it with them.